The smell of his coffee still lingered in the kitchen when I heard the front door lock click behind him. Not the gentle click of someone leaving for work, the deliberate, heavy kind. The kind that means something. I stood at the sink, dish towel in my hands, listening to his car back out of the driveway. Listening until the sound of the engine faded completely. Listening until there was nothing left but the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds outside a window I couldn't open. My husband had left for his conference in Portland. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. He'd kissed me on the cheek the way you kiss a stranger you're trying to be polite to. Grabbed his leather overnight bag and walked out. And locked the deadbolt from the outside. With his key, I stood there for a moment, telling myself I was being paranoid. He probably just forgot. He does that sometimes. Locks the door out of habit without thinking about who's still inside. I'd mention it when he called tonight. We'd laugh about it. He'd apologize in that clipped way of his that wasn't really an apology. I told myself all of that. Then I walked to the front door and tried the handle anyway. Locked. I tried the side door near the garage. He'd bolted it with the sliding bar we never used, the one that needed a specific tool to lift from the outside. I hadn't even known he'd had that installed. My chest went tight in a way I didn't want to name yet. Good morning. I spun around. My husband's father, my father-in-law, was sitting in his wheelchair at the end of the hallway. 81 years old, white hair, hands folded in his lap. He'd been living with us for 14 months. Mild dementia, the doctor said. Needed round-the-clock supervision. Couldn't be left alone. Couldn't manage stairs or the stove or his medications without help. That was why I was here. That was the arrangement. My husband worked, traveled, managed his commercial real estate portfolio. I stayed home and cared for his father. I'd given up my job at the veterinary clinic for this. My apartment. My independence. Did he leave? The old man asked. Yes, I said. Early flight. He nodded slowly, the way he always did. Then he looked at me with those pale gray eyes, clearer than they should have been for 8 in the morning, and said, "You should check the basement." I blinked. What? But he'd already turned his chair toward the living room, moving away from me with that slow electric whir of the motor. I stood in the hallway, telling myself he was confused, that it was the dementia talking. He said things sometimes, strange, disconnected things that didn't track to any real conversation. Last week, he'd told me the roses in the backyard were listening. The week before that, he'd asked me why the ceiling was moving. I went to make breakfast. It was the smell that stopped me, not strong at first. Just a faint sweetness underneath the coffee smell, underneath the dish soap smell, something that didn't quite belong. I set the pan on the stove and reached for the gas knob, and that's when I noticed it was already slightly open. Not enough to hear hissing. Just enough. My hand froze. I turned the knob fully off and stood there, heart starting to thud in a slow, dreadful way. I told myself the knob had been bumped accidentally. I told myself the smell wasn't what I thought it was. I opened the window above the sink as wide as it would go and stood there breathing in the outside air, trying to decide what I actually knew versus what I was afraid of. Then I heard the wheelchair motor behind me again. I turned around. My father-in-law had come back to the kitchen doorway. He was watching me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Focused, careful, precise. It wasn't the expression of a man with dementia. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Sit down, he said. I have to tell you some things, and we don't have a lot of time. I sat. He told me his name was Walter, which I already knew. He told me he'd been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 2 years ago, which I also knew. What I didn't know was that the diagnosis had been mild enough that, for the better part of a year now, he'd had more clarity than confusion. More good hours than bad ones. And he had spent those good hours watching. My son is not a good man, he said. I know that's a terrible thing for a father to say. I've spent a long time not saying it. His hands were steady in his lap. His voice was steady. Whatever tremor I'd attributed to age or illness wasn't there. He took out a life insurance policy on you 8 months ago, Walter said. $2 million. He didn't tell you. I heard the words. I understood the words. I couldn't quite make them land anywhere solid. He took one out on me as well, 2 years ago. He continued wily. But I'm old and I have dementia, and that's not suspicious. You're 32 and healthy. That policy required a story. A story, I repeated. An accident. Something domestic. A fire maybe. A gas leak. He paused, watching my face. He's been experimenting. Small things, to see what I noticed, to see if I'd say anything. I didn't. I let him think I was too far gone to understand. The sweetness in the air. The gas knob. The locked doors. He's done this before, Walter said, and his voice dropped in a way that told me this part was the hardest to say. His first wife, Audrey. They said it was a carbon monoxide accident, faulty furnace. He collected on her policy. He paused. She was 34. I sat very still. I didn't know, he said. Not then. I suspected, the way you suspect something terrible and then spend years convincing yourself you're wrong because the alternative is unlivable. But I've had a lot of time to think these past months, and I found the policy documents in his desk. I found the paperwork. Why didn't you call the police? I asked. My voice came out surprisingly calm. I did, he said, 3 weeks ago. While you were out shopping, I called from my room phone. He looked out the kitchen window for a moment. A detective came to speak with my son. My son told him I had dementia, that I'd been confused lately, making up stories. The detective was very polite, very thorough. And then he left. I understood then. Walter didn't have evidence. He had suspicion, an instinct, and a diagnosis that made him easy to dismiss. And I was the only other person in this house, and no one would listen to me either, the young wife who stood to inherit, the obvious alternative suspect. What do we do? I asked. The documents, he said, in his desk. And here. He reached into the pocket of his cardigan, slowly, deliberately, and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I've been writing things down, dates, what I observed, what I found. I wrote it in the good hours, when my head was clear. I've been doing it for weeks. I took the paper from him. His handwriting was shaky but legible, dates going back 6 months. Notes about phone calls my husband had made, conversations Walter had overheard, the names of the insurance company and the policy numbers. The date my husband had brought home a man he introduced as a contractor who'd spent an hour in the basement and never actually fixed anything Walter could see. The basement. Check the basement. The gas line, I said. The main valve, Walter said. I believe he's been adjusting it. Slowly. He wouldn't want it to happen while he was in the house. He paused. He wanted it to happen while he was in Portland, with witnesses, an alibi. 3 days, maybe 4. I stood up and went to the basement door. I'm not a plumber, I'm not an engineer, but I grew up in a house where my father did his own repairs, where I learned early that a gas smell is an emergency, not a mystery. The main shutoff valve is almost always near where the gas line enters the house. I found it at the base of the wall next to the water heater, and it was not fully closed. It was perhaps a quarter turn from where it should have been, subtle enough that you'd need to know what to look for, obvious enough once you did. I closed it. I stood there in the dim light of the basement for a long minute, listening to the house around me and thinking about Audrey. 34 years old. A faulty furnace. The way a story gets told, and then told again until it becomes the only story anyone remembers. I went back upstairs. The front door is locked from outside, I said. I know. Walter had followed me to the top of the stairs, slowly, carefully, but without the vagueness he wore around my husband. The side door too. The back gate has a padlock he put on last month. He told you it was for security. Can we get out? The kitchen window opens far enough, I measured. I looked at him. I'm 81, he said, with something that might have been a small, dry smile. Not dead. I measured the window 3 weeks ago. I almost laughed. It was the wrong feeling for the moment, but it was real, and I let it pass through me and settle into something I could use. Clarity. Focus. Okay. We get out through the kitchen window. We go to a neighbor. We call the police, and this time we do it with Walter's written documentation, with policy numbers and dates and the contractor's visit, and with the gas line that had been tampered with and then shut off by 2 people who are very much alive and standing in a kitchen that should, by tomorrow, have been a crime scene. He'll be back, I said. If he has any way to monitor. He checks a camera. In the entryway. I found it 2 months ago. Walter's expression was steady. I've been sitting in my usual spot every morning, appearing exactly as confused as I'm supposed to be. I thought about that. This old man, in his wheelchair, performing a version of his own illness for a camera, protecting me. Buying time. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me," he said. "A man with dementia making accusations against his own son. I needed more. I needed to be sure you'd be safe when I told you." He looked at his hands. "I'm sorry it took me this long." I crossed the kitchen and took his hand in both of mine, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I climbed out the kitchen window. My neighbor Deb is 67 years old, a retired school teacher, and she has a phone and a very strong opinion about people who lock their wives inside houses. She didn't ask me many questions. She handed me her phone and put on coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed like she was guarding a checkpoint. I called 911. I told them about the gas line. I told them my husband had locked us in. I told them I had a document written by my father-in-law detailing potential insurance fraud connected to a prior death. And I gave them Audrey's name and the year and the state where she died. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that means something is being written down carefully. 2 officers arrived within 9 minutes. A third car came 20 minutes after that. This one unmarked with a detective named O.C. who shook my hand and asked if I was all right, and then sat with Walter for 45 minutes going through his handwritten notes line by line. The gas company sent someone to inspect the basement. They confirmed the main valve had been deliberately adjusted and found a secondary modification to a connector fitting near the furnace. The kind of modification a person might make if they wanted a slow, undetectable leak that looked like equipment failure. They took photographs. My husband landed in Portland at 11:15 that morning. By noon, Detective O.C. had been in contact with Portland PD. By 2 in the afternoon, my husband had been located at his hotel and taken in for questioning. He told them Walter was confused. He told them I'd been having mental health difficulties. He told them the gas line was old and had been leaking intermittently for months, and he'd been planning to have it properly fixed after the trip. They pulled Audrey's death records. I don't know everything that happened in those next several hours. I know that I sat in Deb's living room and drank 3 cups of coffee and at some point ate a piece of toast without knowing how it got there. I know that Walter sat beside me, upright and alert, and that around 4 o'clock he started to fade a little. The real version. The slow softening that came when the good hours ran out. And I held his hand and told him he'd done well. And he squeezed back. At 7:17 in the evening, Detective O.C. called me. My husband had been arrested. Fraud investigators were involved. The file on Audrey's death had been reopened. It would take time, months, probably longer, before anything was resolved completely. But the detective's voice had that careful steadiness that people use when they're telling you that what you feared was real and that you were right to fear it. There's a version of this story where I don't smell the gas in time, where Walter stays quiet, deciding once again that no one will believe him, where my husband comes back from Portland 3 days later to find exactly what he planned to find, and stands in the front doorway of our house with that expression he wore, the practiced grief, the stunned husband, while the EMTs loaded what was left of us into a vehicle. I think about that version sometimes. What I know is this: Walter had been watching for months. He'd been waiting for the right moment, calculating his risks, writing his observations in a notebook during the clear hours, and hiding the notebook in the false bottom of his old army footlocker, because my husband had never once opened it, never once been curious enough to look. He told me later that he'd tried to protect me from the beginning, had refused to appear too lucid around my husband because a lucid Walter was a dangerous witness, and a dangerous witness might accelerate whatever my husband was planning. He was protecting me by appearing incapable of protecting me. The insurance investigator who reviewed the case told me, much later, that the policy on my life had been set up with a double indemnity clause for accidental death at home. The payout would have been significant enough that my husband could have paid off the debt on 2 of his commercial properties and had a substantial sum left over. Audrey had a similar policy. She'd been 34. Walter moved into a proper care facility 6 months later, a good one, with a garden and a music program and staff who learned his name within the first week. I visited on Sundays. Sometimes his eyes were clear and we'd sit in the garden and talk about whatever came up. The weather, old movies, the nurse who reminded him of someone he'd known in the army. Sometimes he was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't follow, and I'd sit with him anyway. He gave me the notebook before he moved out of the house, handed it to me in its footlocker, lifted the false bottom himself, placed it in my hands. "In case you ever need to remember what actually happened," he said. I still have it. The trial took 16 months. I testified. Walter testified on a good day. with his written notes in front of him and a patience in the courtroom that I recognized. The same patience he'd had in the hallway, watching and waiting and being absolutely sure before he spoke. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Afterward, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking garage for a long time, not going anywhere. Thinking about choices I'd made that had led me to that house, to that marriage, to a kitchen window I'd had to climb out of to save my own life. Thinking about Audrey, who hadn't had a Walter, who hadn't had a Walter, who hadn't had someone watching carefully from a wheelchair in the hallway, cataloging everything, keeping records in a hidden notebook. I thought about how many versions of this story end differently. Then I started the car and drove to the care facility because it was Sunday and Walter's good hours were usually in the afternoon, and I wanted to sit in the garden and tell him it was over. He already knew somehow. He looked at my face when I came through the door and he nodded once, that slow, deliberate nod, and said, "Good." Just that. Good. I sat down next to him and we watched the garden for a while and didn't say anything else, and it was enough. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the gas, or the locked doors, or the moment I realized my husband had planned for me to die in that house while he was 3 states away with an alibi. But that's not it. The hardest part was understanding how long it had been building, how many ordinary mornings I'd stood at that sink, how many times I'd told myself I was imagining things, how many small wrongnesses I'd smoothed over, because the alternative, that the person sharing my life had decided my life was worth more to him, ended, was simply too large to hold. I think about Walter a lot, not the Walter people see when I tell this story. The dramatic version, the old man in the wheelchair who saved the day. I think about the Walter who sat across from me at dinner for 14 months, performing confusion he didn't feel, watching my husband the way you watch something dangerous that doesn't know you've seen it. He made a choice, every single day, to stay quiet and stay careful and keep writing in that notebook. He wasn't sure it would work. He told me that later. He said he wasn't even sure I'd believe him when the moment came, but he kept going anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and he'd already done nothing once, with Audrey, and he'd spent years carrying that. That's the thing about Walter that I keep coming back to. He wasn't some genius. He wasn't fearless. He was an 81-year-old man with a real diagnosis and real bad days and a son he loved who turned out to be someone he couldn't protect people from. And he did it anyway. Imperfectly, slowly, with shaky handwriting in a hidden notebook. He did what he could with what he had. I've thought a lot about what separates people who act from people who don't when the stakes are real. I don't think it's courage exactly. Not the dramatic kind. I think it's just the refusal to pretend you don't know what you know. Walter knew. He stopped letting himself unknow it. And that decision, made quietly over months in a room where nobody was watching, is what changed everything. There's a cause to every effect, and my husband understood that when he planned what he planned. He just miscalculated which causes mattered. He thought the locked doors were the variable. He thought the gas line was the variable. He didn't account for an old man who'd decided that bearing witness was the one thing he could still do right. And I think about myself in that kitchen, smelling something that didn't belong and reaching for the stove knob. I almost talked myself out of it. That's what I want people to understand. The story almost went differently, not because of anything dramatic, but because I almost chose comfort over truth, almost decided not to know. Don't do that. When something doesn't smell right, literally or otherwise, don't reach for the easier story. The truth will still be there whether you look at it or not. The only difference is whether you get to respond to it. Walter gave me the notebook before he moved out. He said, in case you need to remember what actually happened. I think what he meant was, in case the world tries to tell you a softer version, keep the real one. I'm keeping it.